Look closely at this screen. What you are seeing is arguably the most technologically advanced military force in Southeast Asia. It possesses the most lethal air force in the region. Its navy can dominate the vital straits of global trade. Its army can mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers in hours. This is the Singapore Armed Forces today, a military machine designed to kill fast, strike hard, and defend the island at all costs. It looks like the arsenal of a superpower. But this image is a lie. Or rather, it is the result of the greatest bluff in history. Because if you turn back the clock to August 9th, 1965, this military power evaporates instantly. On the day of its independence, Singapore was not a fortress. It was a defenseless victim waiting to be slaughtered. Lee Kuan Yew looked at his army and saw a disaster. He had 2 infantry battalions. That was it. They were poorly equipped. They had old rifles. But worse than that, they weren't even loyal to him. Most of the soldiers were Malay. Their commanders were Malaysians. They took their orders from Kuala Lumpur, not from Singapore. If Lee Kuan Yew picked up the phone to give an order, they might not just ignore him. They might arrest him. Singapore was a nation born naked. It had no shield. It had no sword. And it was floating in a dangerous sea. Imagine being a tiny Chinese-majority island. Now, imagine being squeezed between 2 massive Muslim-majority neighbors who are hostile to your existence. To the north, Malaysia, still angry about the separation. To the south, Indonesia, a giant led by nationalists who had already launched bombing attacks on Singapore's streets. Lee Kuan Yew knew the math. Singapore had 2 million people. Its neighbors had over 100 million. It was a shrimp swimming among sharks. If Malaysia decided to invade to take back the island, or if Indonesia decided to wipe out the Chinese infidels, Singapore would last maybe 24 hours. There would be no resistance, just a massacre. Lee Kuan Yew was terrified. He famously said, "I felt the dampness of the grave." He needed an army, and he needed it yesterday. But who would help him? He wrote urgent letters to India. They ignored him. He wrote to Egypt. They politely refused. Nobody wanted to help the Chinese outcast. Nobody wanted to offend the powerful Muslim nations of the region. Singapore was alone, or so the world thought. In absolute desperation, Lee Kuan Yew made a decision that was so dangerous it could have destroyed his country before it even started. He reached out to the only other nation on earth that understood what it felt like to be small, surrounded, and hated: Israel. On Christmas Eve 1965, a secret message was sent from Jerusalem to Singapore. The Israelis said, yes. They saw a mirror image of themselves, a tiny state fighting for survival against massive odds. They agreed to send their best generals. They agreed to send weapons. They agreed to build the Singaporean army from scratch, modeling it exactly after the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. But there was a catch, a massive, deadly catch. You have to remember, this is the heart of the Islamic world in Southeast Asia. Solidarity with the Palestinian cause was and is intense in Malaysia and Indonesia. If the neighbors found out that Zionists were on Singaporean soil teaching Chinese soldiers how to fight, it wouldn't be seen as a military alliance. It would be seen as a religious provocation. It could trigger a holy war. Mobs would burn Singapore to the ground. The Malaysian army would invade instantly to protect the faith. Lee Kuan Yew knew this. So he created a cover story. When the Israeli military advisors arrived in Singapore, they were forbidden from saying where they were from. They were told to grow mustaches. They were told to tan their skin. And if anyone asked, they were given a specific script. They were not Israeli generals. They were agronomists from Mexico. This is the story of how a group of Mexicans secretly built the most lethal army in Asia right under the noses of their enemies. This is the story of the poison shrimp. Welcome to the LKY Files. To understand the magnitude of the danger, we have to look at the map through the eyes of Lee Kuan Yew on the morning of August 10, 1965, the day after independence. The champagne had not been popped. Instead, there was a funeral atmosphere in the cabinet room because the independence of Singapore was not a dream come true, it was a geopolitical nightmare come to life. For over a century, the safety of this island had been guaranteed by the might of the British Empire, as the Union Jack flying over the harbor meant that anyone who messed with Singapore would have to answer to the Royal Navy. But in London, the mood had changed, and the British economy was crumbling, leading the Prime Minister Harold Wilson to announce the East of Suez policy, which was a polite way of saying the British were packing their bags, closing their massive naval bases, and abandoning their former colonies to fend for themselves. Lee Kuan Yew begged them to stay, pleading for just a few more years of protection, but the timeline was set, leaving Singapore naked. This abandonment could not have happened at a worse moment, because the region was already on fire due to a conflict known as konfrontasi. The president of Indonesia, Sukarno, viewed the creation of Malaysia and the existence of Singapore as a neo-colonial plot, and he launched a violent campaign of terror to destabilize the region. This wasn't a Cold War, it was hot, and it was happening on the streets of Singapore. Indonesian saboteurs infiltrated the island, planting bombs in public places, targeting hotels, cinemas, and bus stops. The most horrific incident had just occurred at McDonald House on Orchard Road, where a bomb tore through the building, killing innocent civilians and injuring dozens more. Every time a Singaporean stepped out of their house, they wondered if they would be blown up, and Lee Kuan Yew knew that if Indonesia decided to escalate from terrorism to full-scale invasion, there was nothing stopping them. But the external threat of Indonesian bombs and the British departure was only half the nightmare, because the true horror, the thing that kept Lee Kuan Yew awake at night, was not the enemy outside the gates, but the enemy inside the barracks. On paper, Singapore had an army consisting of 2 infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments, but in reality these were not Singaporean soldiers in spirit. These units had been formed when Singapore was part of Malaysia, and their demographic composition reflected that reality, being overwhelmingly Malay and Muslim. The officers were commanded by a Malaysian brigadier named Syed Mohammed Alsagoff, a man who took his orders directly from the military headquarters in Kuala Lumpur, not from the new government in Singapore. This created a terrifying scenario where Lee Kuan Yew was the prime minister of a country where his own army was loyal to a foreign power that had just expelled him. The racial tensions were at a boiling point, having just seen bloody race riots in 1964 between Chinese and Malays that left bodies in the streets. Lee Kuan Yew lived in constant fear of a coup, knowing that at any moment the Malaysian government could simply order Brigadier Alsagoff to arrest the Singaporean cabinet and take control of the island under the pretext of restoring order. It was a Trojan horse scenario where the protectors were potential executioners. Lee Kuan Yew realized with chilling clarity that he didn't just need to upgrade the army, he needed to completely replace it. He needed a force that looked like Singapore, a force that was loyal to Singapore, and a force that would not hesitate to shoot if Malaysian or Indonesian troops crossed the causeway. But building an army requires time, weapons, and training doctrines that Singapore simply did not have. He was a lawyer, not a general, and his inner circle consisted of economists and academics, not warriors. They were starting from zero, with a ticking clock, surrounded by neighbors who viewed their independence as a temporary mistake that could be easily corrected with a military invasion. The survival of the nation depended on solving this impossible puzzle. How do you build a military machine capable of scaring giants when you don't even have a single general to lead it? With the British clock ticking down and the internal threat of a mutinous army looming over his head, Lee Kuan Yew knew he could not build a military alone, as Singapore lacked the expertise, the officers, and the doctrine to create a fighting force from scratch. He needed a mentor, a big brother who could step in and teach this infant nation how to walk before the wolves devoured it. His first instinct was not to look at the controversial state of Israel, but rather to look towards his friends in the non-aligned movement, the group of post-colonial nations that promised to stand together against the dominance of the superpowers. Lee believed in this brotherhood, and he believed that the great Asian powers would come to the aid of a fellow Asian nation in distress. His first letter was sent to India, addressed to Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri. It made perfect sense on paper because India was a massive democracy, it shared a British military heritage with Singapore, and it had a large professional army that was battle-hardened. Lee Kuan Yew asked for military advisors to come to Singapore and train his new battalions, hoping that Indian officers would provide a neutral, professional foundation that wouldn't antagonize his neighbors. But the reply from New Delhi was a polite but devastating cold shoulder. Shastri, despite his personal sympathy for Lee, was paralyzed by his own geopolitical nightmare, as India was locked in a perpetual standoff with Pakistan over Kashmir. The Indian government calculated that if they helped Chinese-majority Singapore build an army to defend against Muslim-majority Malaysia and Indonesia, Pakistan would use it as propaganda to inflame the entire Islamic world against India. They could not risk losing the support of the Arab nations and the broader Muslim bloc for the sake of a tiny island in the South China Sea. So India said no. Lee Kuan Yew swallowed his pride and turned to his second hope, Egypt. At the time, President Gamal Abdel Nasser was the titan of the Arab world and a charismatic leader whom Lee Kuan Yew deeply admired and considered a personal friend. Egypt was the heart of the non-aligned movement, and Nasser had projected himself as the defender of small, independent nations fighting against imperialism. Lee wrote to Cairo, asking for naval advisors and military instructors, thinking that surely Nasser, the revolutionary hero, would help secure Singapore's independence. But once again, geopolitics crushed idealism. Nasser looked at the map and saw that Indonesia and Malaysia were two of the most populous Muslim nations on earth. He needed their support in his own struggles against Israel and the West in the Middle East, and he simply could not afford to be seen arming a Chinese enclave against his Muslim brothers in Southeast Asia. The reply from Cairo was filled with diplomatic niceties, but the answer was a firm refusal. The rejection from Egypt and India was a psychological blow that shattered Lee Kuan Yew's worldview. It taught him a brutal lesson that would define Singapore's foreign policy forever. In the cold light of day, there is no such thing as international solidarity, only national interest. When the chips were down, nobody cared about justice, nobody cared about the underdog, and nobody was coming to save them. Singapore was not just an orphan, it was a leper, radioactive to the very neighbors it tried to befriend. The silence from the world powers was deafening, and as the weeks passed, the vulnerability of the island grew more acute. It was in this vacuum of despair that a file landed on Lee Kuan Yew's desk that he had previously pushed aside. It was a dossier on the state of Israel. For months, Israeli diplomats had been quietly signaling that they were willing to help. They saw in Singapore a mirror image of themselves, a tiny nation with no natural resources, surrounded by much larger hostile neighbors who questioned its right to exist and forced to rely on brain power and military superiority to survive. The Israelis were eager to break their own diplomatic isolation and find a friend in Asia, so they offered to send their best generals and build an army from the ground up. For Lee Kuan Yew, this was the most dangerous decision of his entire political career. He knew that accepting Israeli help was playing with fire, perhaps even inviting his own destruction. The Malay population in Singapore, along with the governments of Malaysia and Indonesia, viewed Israel not as a state but as an enemy of Islam. If news leaked that Zionist agents were on Singaporean soil teaching Chinese soldiers how to kill, it wouldn't just cause a diplomatic incident. It could trigger a holy war. The cry of jihad could rally millions of people across the straits to invade Singapore, not for territory, but for religion. Lee debated furiously with his inner circle, weighing the risk of an immediate invasion against the certainty of a slow death without an army. His defense minister, Goh Keng Swee, was the one who pushed the hardest, arguing that they had run out of options and that the Israelis were the only ones tough enough, smart enough, and desperate enough to help. They didn't just need soldiers, they needed a doctrine of total defense, and Israel was the only country in the world that had perfected the art of mobilizing an entire civilian population for war. Lee Kuan Yew looked at the reality of his situation. The British were leaving, the Indians and Egyptians had turned their backs, and the Indonesians were bombing his streets. He realized he had no choice but to dance with the devil he didn't know. He gave the order to proceed, but with one absolute, non-negotiable condition. The entire operation had to be shrouded in total secrecy. The Israelis could come, but they could not exist. They would have to be ghosts. This decision marked the crossing of the Rubicon, as Lee Kuan Yew picked up the phone to call Tel Aviv, knowing that he was either saving his country or signing its death warrant. Once the call was made to Tel Aviv, the machinery of the Israeli Defense Forces began to turn with silent efficiency. For Israel, this request from a tiny island in Southeast Asia was not just a business transaction, it was a golden geopolitical opportunity. The Jewish state was desperate for friends, isolated in the Middle East, and largely shunned by the Afro-Asian bloc that viewed it as an outpost of Western imperialism. In Singapore, the Israelis saw a rare chance to break their diplomatic containment, to establish a foothold in a strategic corner of the globe, and to prove that their military doctrine could work anywhere. They assembled a team of their finest military minds, not the second-tier officers, but the battle-hardened veterans of the 1948 and 1956 wars, men who knew exactly what it meant to fight with their backs against the sea. Leading this clandestine mission was a man of legendary toughness named Rehavam Ze'evi, known to his troops by the ironic nickname Gandhi. Ze'evi was a man carved from granite, a Palmach veteran who believed in aggressive defense and absolute discipline. He didn't just bring a training manual, he brought a philosophy. He looked at Singapore's flat terrain and lack of strategic depth, and realized that the British model of slow, deliberate warfare would be suicidal here. Singapore needed to be built in the image of the IDF, fast, preemptive, and citizen-based. But before Ze'evi and his team could teach a single tactic, they had to solve the immediate problem of their identity. The arrival of a high-level Israeli military delegation in the heart of the Malay-Muslim world was a secret so explosive that it had to be buried under layers of deception. They could not enter Singapore as Israelis. They could not wear IDF uniforms. They could not speak Hebrew in public. They needed a cover story that was plausible enough to satisfy curiosity, but boring enough to prevent deep inquiries. The solution they concocted was almost comical in its audacity. The Singaporean government announced that they were bringing in a team of consultants to help with national development, but they wouldn't call them soldiers. They officially referred to them as Mexican agronomists. The logic was that Mexicans were swarthy and tanned, much like the Israelis. And in 1965 Singapore, almost nobody had ever met a real Mexican. It was a flimsy disguise, relying entirely on the ignorance of the local population. When the first team of 7 officers arrived in late 1965, led by Colonel Jack Elazari, the tension was palpable. They were whisked away from the airport in unmarked cars to secret safe houses. They were given strict instructions. Do not carry anything with Hebrew writing, do not discuss religion, and if anyone asks about your family, you are from Mexico City. This charade required a terrifying level of discipline. Imagine the psychological strain of these men, battle-hardened commanders, having to pretend to be farming experts while secretly designing the entire defense architecture of a nation. They set up their headquarters inside the Singapore Ministry of Interior and Defense, working behind locked doors with blacked-out windows. Inside those rooms, they were drafting the Brown Book, the master plan for the Singapore Armed Forces, detailing everything from recruitment protocols to mobilization speeds. But outside those rooms, they were ghosts. They couldn't socialize. They couldn't go to bars. They were warned that Singapore was crawling with Malaysian and Indonesian intelligence agents. If a Malaysian spy had spotted a Star of David pendant or overheard a snippet of Hebrew conversation in a hotel lobby, the news would have been on the front pages of Jakarta newspapers the next morning. The headline, "Singapore Training with Zionists to Kill Muslims," would have triggered the invasion Lee Kuan Yew feared. The cultural clash inside the training camps was just as intense as the secrecy outside. The Mexicans were loud, direct, and aggressive. They didn't care about face or Asian social hierarchies. They yelled at officers and enlisted men alike. They demanded that officers eat the same food as their soldiers and march in the mud with them, a revolutionary concept in a society where the officer class expected to be treated like royalty. The Singaporean recruits were initially baffled by these strange Mexicans who didn't seem to know anything about farming, but knew everything about mortars and ambushes. There were moments of friction where the entire operation almost collapsed, moments where the aggressive Israeli style clashed with the reserved Singaporean temperament. But Gandhi, Ze'avi, and his team were relentless. They drilled into the Singaporean leadership that they didn't have the luxury of politeness. They were teaching them how to survive a war of annihilation. Slowly, the disguise became an open secret within the highest ranks of the military, but the public remained largely in the dark. The Mexicans were building the Singapore Armed Forces Training Institute, SAFTI, from the ground up, turning a patch of jungle into a factory for soldiers. They weren't just training troops, they were cloning themselves. They selected the smartest, toughest young Singaporeans and molded them into a new caste of officer, teaching them that in a small army, every single soldier has to be a leader. As the months passed, the Mexican cover story held precariously. The foundation was being poured in the shadows, hidden from the prying eyes of the neighbors. But training officers was the easy part. The real challenge, the one that would test the very soul of the nation, was about to begin. To build a real army, Lee Kuan Yew needed bodies. Thousands of them. And to get them, he would have to force an entire generation of young men to do something they despised. He was about to introduce the draft. The arrival of the Mexicans and their secret blueprints solved the problem of strategy, but it did not solve the problem of manpower. And this is where Lee Kuan Yew ran into a wall that was centuries old and made of solid granite. He was fighting against the deep-seated DNA of Chinese culture, summarized by an ancient proverb that every grandmother in Singapore knew by heart. Good iron is not made into nails, and good men are not made into soldiers. In the Confucian hierarchy of society, the scholar was at the top, the farmer and the artisan were in the middle, and the merchant was below them. But the soldier? The soldier was at the very bottom, considered the lowest of the low, a profession reserved for bandits, criminals, and failures who couldn't make it in civil society. Singapore was a city of migrants who had come to make money, to build businesses, and to send their children to university. They had not traveled thousands of miles across the ocean to watch their sons die in a jungle wearing a green uniform. The very idea of military service was repulsive to the Chinese psyche, viewed as a waste of a life that could be better spent studying or trading. Lee Kuan Yew looked at his population and saw a nation of shopkeepers and clerks, soft, urban, and physically unimposing, while across the border the Malaysians and Indonesians had a martial culture that glorified the warrior. The Israelis observing this were blunt in their assessment. They told Lee that he didn't just need to train soldiers. He needed to completely rewire the psychology of his people. They proposed a radical solution that would shake Singaporean society to its foundations: national service. Not a small volunteer force, but mandatory conscription for every single male turning 18, regardless of race, religion, or social status. The Israelis argued that this was the only way to generate the numbers needed to defend the island, but more importantly, it was the only way to forge a national identity. If the rich banker's son and the poor hawker's son crawled through the same mud, ate the same rations, and relied on each other for survival, the racial and class divides would begin to dissolve. When the National Service Amendment Act was passed in 1967, it triggered a wave of hysteria and panic across the island that is hard to imagine today. Parents were horrified, viewing the draft notices as death sentences. Wealthy families immediately tried to find loopholes, looking for doctors who would certify their sons as unfit or buying plane tickets to send them overseas to study indefinitely. They besieged their members of parliament, begging, bribing, and threatening to get exemptions. But Lee Kuan Yew and his defense minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, were immovable objects. They knew that if they granted a single exception to a rich family, the entire system would collapse, because the poor would see it as a tax on their blood, while the rich stayed safe. Lee utilized the police force to enforce the draft with ruthless efficiency. If a boy didn't show up at the depot, the police went to his house. If he had fled the country, he was branded a criminal and barred from ever returning. Lee sent a chilling message to the elite. If you leave, you leave. But you will never belong here again. The training itself, designed by the Israelis, was a deliberate form of shock therapy. The Mexicans did not believe in coddling. They set up training camps in the most inhospitable parts of the island and designed a curriculum meant to break the individual ego. Singaporean boys, many of whom had never spent a night outdoors or washed their own clothes, were suddenly thrown into the jungle for weeks. They were screamed at by instructors, forced to march until they collapsed, and subjected to the standby bed inspections where a single speck of dust meant the entire platoon would be punished. The Israelis taught them aggressive, high-tempo warfare, the kind that required supreme physical fitness. It was brutal, it was exhausting, and it was exactly what was needed. The transformation was physical and mental. Scrawny, bespectacled teenagers turned into tanned, muscular men who walked with a new kind of confidence. But Lee Kuan Yew knew that force alone wasn't enough. He needed to win the hearts and minds. He launched a massive, statewide propaganda campaign to rebrand the image of the soldier. He made sure that national service officers were seen at the most prestigious state functions. He appeared in public inspecting guards of honor, always praising the rugged society. The government filled the newspapers and television with images of smart, disciplined soldiers protecting the nation. They created a narrative that to serve was the ultimate sign of manhood and citizenship, and that those who didn't serve were somehow incomplete. He even tied economic future to military service. Companies were encouraged to hire reservists, and government jobs often required a good conduct record from the Army. Slowly, painfully, the culture began to shift. The nail was no longer seen as waste. It was seen as the steel spine of the nation. The mama's boys were disappearing, and in their place, a generation of citizen soldiers was rising, trained by ghosts to fight like lions. With the manpower pipeline secured through national service and the training grounds established by the hidden Israeli advisors, Lee Kuan Yew and his generals faced the next existential hurdle: the brutal reality of geography. In military strategy, there is a concept known as strategic depth, which essentially means having enough land to retreat, regroup, and counterattack if an enemy invades your borders. The Soviet Union survived the Nazis because they could trade space for time, retreating thousands of miles into the Russian winter. But Singapore did not have thousands of miles. It barely had 20 miles from one end to the other. If a Malaysian tank division crossed the causeway in the north, they could be sipping coffee in the central business district in the south within 30 minutes. Singapore had zero strategic depth, meaning that in a conventional war, one mistake, one lost battle, or 1 hour of hesitation would mean the end of the nation. The Israeli advisors looked at the map and told Lee the hard truth. You cannot fight a defensive war on this island, because by the time you start fighting, the war is already lost. This geographical claustrophobia gave birth to a military doctrine that Lee Kuan Yew famously christened the poison shrimp. The metaphor was simple, visceral, and terrifyingly clear to everyone in the region. In the ocean, a shrimp is small, soft, and defenseless, a natural prey for larger fish, but some shrimp are toxic. If a larger fish swallows a poison shrimp, it might succeed in eating it, but it will suffer such agonizing pain or even death that the meal isn't worth the price. This was the core of Singapore's new defense philosophy: deterrence through the promise of mutual destruction. Lee Kuan Yew knew that Singapore could probably not defeat the combined might of Indonesia and Malaysia in a long, drawn-out war of attrition, as the numbers were simply too overwhelming. Therefore, the goal of the Singapore Armed Forces was not necessarily to win a total victory, but to make the cost of invasion so astronomically high that no rational leader in Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur would ever dare to give the order. To achieve this state of toxicity, the Israelis taught the Singaporeans that their defense had to be based on speed and ferocity. Since they had no land to retreat into, they had to fight in the enemy's territory, not their own. This meant that the Singaporean military doctrine was secretly offensive in nature. If war was imminent, Singapore would not wait to be attacked. They would launch a preemptive strike, pushing their armored columns north into Malaysia to create a buffer zone, turning the enemy's land into the battlefield. This required a level of readiness that was unheard of in Southeast Asia. The poison shrimp doctrine dictated that the entire reserve force of the nation had to be mobilizable within hours, not days. Every civilian with a day job had a uniform in his closet and a rifle waiting for him at the depot, ready to transform from a banker into a soldier at the sound of a siren. The message sent to the neighbors was psychological as much as it was physical. Lee Kuan Yew wanted the generals in the neighboring capitals to look at Singapore and see a hornet's nest. He wanted them to understand that while they might eventually crush the island through sheer mass, the process would leave their own armies broken, their economies shattered, and their cities burning. It was a strategy of digestive indigestion on a lethal scale. The poison shrimp didn't need to be the king of the ocean. It just needed to be the one meal that was guaranteed to kill the predator. By accepting that they couldn't win a long war, Singapore focused all its energy on being the deadliest combatant in the first 48 hours, creating a deterrent so frightening that peace became the only logical option for its enemies. For 4 years, the work had been done in the shadows, hidden behind the walls of restricted camps and the jungle canopies of the training grounds. The Mexican advisors had done their job, molding raw recruits into soldiers. But a secret army is only useful if your enemy knows it exists to fear it. Deterrence, by definition, requires visibility. You cannot scare a bully if he thinks your pockets are empty. By the summer of 1969, Lee Kuan Yew decided that the time for secrecy was over. It was time to pull back the curtain and show the world, and specifically the generals in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, that the poison shrimp had grown a hard shell. The occasion chosen for this geopolitical theater was the National Day Parade of 1969, a celebration meant to mark the 150th anniversary of modern Singapore's founding, but Lee intended to turn it into a display of raw military muscle. Unknown to the public and the foreign intelligence agencies operating in the city, Singapore had made a clandestine purchase that would change the balance of power in the region. With the help of the Israelis, the government had quietly acquired 30 AMX-13 light tanks. These were not the newest machines on the market. They were French-made, battle-worn, and refurbished by Israel. But in the context of Southeast Asia in the late 60s, they were the equivalent of a nuclear weapon. At that time, the Malaysian army was primarily an infantry force. They did not have a significant armored division. The prevailing military wisdom was that tanks were useless in the jungle and swampy terrain of the region, a myth that the British had believed until the Japanese rode bicycles and light tanks through the peninsula in WO2. Lee Kuan Yew was about to prove that armor could and would dominate the streets of Singapore. The logistics of hiding 30 tanks on a tiny island for months was a miracle of security, but the moment of truth had arrived. On the morning of August 9th, the Padang, the ceremonial field in the heart of the city, was packed. In the VIP stands sat the representatives of Malaysia and Indonesia, smiling, expecting a typical post-colonial parade of policemen, marching bands, and perhaps a few trade union floats. They viewed Singapore as a commercial hub, not a military power. They were comfortable in their superiority. Then, the ground began to tremble. A low, guttural rumble drowned out the cheers of the crowd, a sound that is unmistakable to anyone who has ever been near heavy armor. The smiles on the faces of the foreign dignitaries froze as the first column of AMX-13 tanks rolled into view, their tracks chewing up the asphalt, their cannons pointed towards the sky. The shock was electric. It rippled through the crowd, not just among the Singaporeans who cheered with a sudden fierce pride, but among the foreign observers who stared in disbelief. This was not a bluff. This was steel. The mere presence of these tanks sent a terrifyingly clear message. Singapore could now conduct mobile warfare. They could push across the causeway. They could punch through an infantry blockade. The Mexican agronomists had not just grown crops. They had grown a mechanized division. The diplomatic cables sent back to Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta that evening were frantic. The strategic calculus had changed in a single hour. Singapore was no longer just a defenseless island that could be bullied or threatened with a police action. It was a fortress with heavy armor. This was the Great Bluff in action. In reality, those 30 tanks were practically the entire armored force of the nation. The crews were newly trained, the logistics were still shaky, and in a sustained war, they might have run out of ammunition or fuel quickly. But in the world of deterrence, perception is reality. Lee Kuan Yew had successfully projected an image of overwhelming strength. He had signaled that any invasion would not be a walkover. It would be a tank battle. The psychological impact was immediate. The tone of diplomatic communication shifted from condescension to caution. The threats of crushing Singapore evaporated, replaced by a wary respect. The poison shrimp had shown its venom, and for the first time since independence, the neighbors realized that swallowing this island might just be fatal. As the decades passed and Singapore transformed from a struggling port into a glistening financial metropolis, the military logic of the poison shrimp began to feel outdated and dangerously inadequate. The problem with the shrimp strategy was that it was inherently suicidal. It promised that Singapore would destroy the enemy, but it tacitly admitted that Singapore would be destroyed in the process. For a nation that was now accumulating billions of dollars in wealth, housing a world-class airport, and hosting global banks, the concept of mutual destruction was no longer an acceptable outcome. Lee Kuan Yew and his successors realized that they didn't just want to hurt the enemy, they wanted to survive the fight with their city intact. Thus, in the early 1980s, the doctrine evolved from the poison shrimp to the porcupine. The logic of the porcupine was distinct. It was no longer about waiting to be swallowed and then releasing toxins. It was about keeping the predator at a distance so painful that it could never get close enough to bite. This shift marked a massive investment in long-range capabilities and defensive shields. Singapore began buying advanced artillery, surface-to-air missile systems, and guided munitions that extended its defensive perimeter far beyond its own shoreline. The message to potential aggressors changed from, "If you invade, we will both die," to, "If you try to approach, you will bleed before you even see our coast." The porcupine didn't need to attack, but its quills were sharp, long, and pointed in every direction, creating a zone of denial that made the island impenetrable. But military technology moves fast, and by the 1990s and 2000s, simply sitting back and waiting behind a shield was seen as a strategic risk. Singapore lacked strategic depth, meaning it had no land to retreat into. So the military planners decided they had to create artificial strategic depth by pushing their defensive line hundreds of miles outwards. This birthed the third and most sophisticated evolution of their doctrine, the dolphin. Dolphins are intelligent, agile, and most importantly, they swim far out into the ocean to hunt sharks rather than waiting in the shallow water. This symbolized the rise of the Republic of Singapore Air Force, RSAF, and the Navy as the primary instruments of national power. Lee Kuan Yew authorized the purchase of the most advanced aerial platforms money could buy, turning the RSAF into the absolute apex predator of Southeast Asian skies. They acquired fleets of American F-15 and F-16 fighter jets, customized with cutting-edge avionics that outperformed anything their neighbors possessed. They bought mid-air refueling tankers, allowing their jets to fly thousands of miles without landing, meaning Singaporean planes could strike targets deep inside enemy territory before the enemy even started their engines. Today, military analysts estimate that Singapore's air force is more potent than Malaysia's and Indonesia's combined, not necessarily in terms of raw numbers of hulls, but in terms of lethality, readiness, and technology. The Dolphin strategy meant that if war ever came, the fighting would not happen on Orchard Road. It would happen over the aggressor's own bases, far away from Singaporean homes. This transformation was underpinned by the continued, though now less secret, relationship with Israel. As warfare moved into the digital age, Singapore mirrored the IDF's obsession with technology. They moved into the era of the third-generation and fourth-generation armed forces, focusing on cyber warfare, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and network-centric fighting. Just as Israel became a startup nation of military tech, Singapore invested billions in its own Defense Science and Technology Agency, DSTA. They developed systems where a single soldier on the ground could use a tablet to see what a drone sees and call in a precision airstrike from a ship 50 miles away. This smart army concept was the ultimate equalizer. It meant that even if the enemy had more soldiers, they would be blind and deaf against Singapore's digital superiority. The evolution was complete. The helpless shrimp had mutated into a high-tech predator, capable of projecting power far beyond its tiny borders, ensuring that peace was maintained not through goodwill, but through overwhelming technological dominance. As we close the file on the operation of the Mexicans, we are left with one of the most enduring, albeit discreet, alliances in modern geopolitical history. The secret is, of course, no longer a secret. In 2000, Lee Kuan Yew finally made an official visit to Israel, acknowledging the debt that his nation owed to the Jewish state. But even today, the relationship retains a quiet, almost shadowy character, often conducted behind closed doors rather than at public press conferences. It is a bond forged not in shared culture or religion, but in the shared trauma of vulnerability. Both nations understand what it means to be a little red dot on a map surrounded by vast swathes of green, living with the eternal anxiety that a single moment of weakness could lead to extinction. The Israeli advisors eventually went home, but their DNA remains embedded in the very marrow of the Singapore Armed Forces, from the conscription model to the aggressive tactical doctrines, ensuring that the two nations remain blood brothers in the art of survival. This entire saga serves as the ultimate validation of Lee Kuan Yew's worldview, a philosophy that owes less to modern liberal idealism and more to the brutal realism of Niccolo Machiavelli. When Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, Lee could have chosen the path of the victim. He could have appealed to the United Nations, relied on international law, or hoped that his neighbors would treat him with brotherly love. But Lee Kuan Yew looked at the history of the world and realized a dark truth. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. He decided that Singapore would never be weak again. He proved Machiavelli's famous maxim that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. By building a secret army capable of inflicting terrible damage, he didn't seek to be loved by Malaysia or Indonesia. He sought to be respected and, if necessary, feared. He understood that in the anarchic system of international relations, a treaty is just a piece of paper, but a tank division is a fact. Today, the result of this paranoia is visible in every budget report released by the Singaporean government. The city-state consistently spends more on defense than almost any other nation in the region, often allocating up to 20% of its government expenditure to the military, a staggering figure for a country that is technically at peace. It spends more than Malaysia and Indonesia combined in many years, despite having a fraction of their population. To the casual tourist shopping on Orchard Road or sipping a cocktail at Marina Bay Sands, this seems absurd. Why does a peaceful trading hub need submarines and Apache helicopters? But the peace of modern Singapore is an armed peace. It is a tranquility that exists only because the cost of breaking it is too high. The skyscrapers of the financial district stand tall only because the fighter jets of the RSAF are patrolling the skies above them. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is often debated in terms of economics or civil liberties, but his greatest achievement might be the one that is hardest to see, the war that never happened. By preparing for war every single day for 50 years, by turning his people into soldiers and his island into a fortress, he ensured that no enemy ever dared to cross the causeway. He built a peace based not on hope, but on steel. The Mexicans may have left, but the poison shrimp evolved into a deadly predator, ensuring that the little red dot would never be swallowed. This is the brutal, unspoken secret of Singapore's success. To learn more about the hidden strategies that shaped our world, the deals made in the shadows, and the leaders who played the game of power better than anyone else, make sure you are subscribed to the LKY Files. The class is dismissed.